18th of June. My name is Patty Holly. I'm the manager of the Jean Golding Institute. First, I want to share some housekeeping points. So be aware that this session is being recorded, and I hope you have read through the JJI Code of Conduct and the policy for virtual events. Mute your microphone unless stated otherwise by the presenter and the speaker. And please complete the registration form. It has only a couple of questions, and also the feedback form at the end of the event. Please introduce yourselves on the chat box, your name, role, and where you're from, so we can know more about you. In this session, you can ask questions through the session using Slido. Please log into slido.com, and on the left-hand side, you can type the number of this session, 070103. That number is also in the chat. And yes, please share your questions, and I'll ask them at the end of the event. The Jean Golding Institute is a central hub for data science and data-intensive research. We're one of 5 university research institutes, and we connect multidisciplinary experts throughout the university and beyond. The Jean Golding Institute collaborates with national and international partners such as the Strathmore University in Nairobi, Kenya, and they're going to be speaking this week as well. The Institute of Statistical Mathematics in Tokyo, Japan, and national partners like the UK the Data Science and AI Institute, the Alan Turing Institute. We offer a range of events, training, funding opportunities, and we coordinate a data science consultancy service called Ask JJI. You can find more information on our website, bristol.ac.uk/Golding. Here is an overview of the events this week. We have 40 events, color-coded, seminars in yellow, training in blue, and workshops in green. You can download a copy of this form from our website, so do take a look, and I hope you can join us in more events. Thanks to the generous contributions of our collaborators and partners, all of Data Week events, including the training, are free of charge, so thanks so much. There are many opportunities to connect and keep in touch. We have organized 2 lunchtime networking sessions on Tuesday and Friday at 1 p.m. so you can come and meet the team, so please do. And look at our blog, subscribe to our newsletter, and join. We have a data ethics club that runs every 2 weeks. And you can continue these conversations on Twitter at JJI Bristol, #Bristol Data Week. There are also opportunities to get involved in our next big event, the JJI Showcase, taking place on the 17th, 18th of February next year. We hope that this is going to be our first face-to-face event taking place in the M Shed, and this family-friendly event will be open to the public. We will showcasing the latest in data science and AI, and also highlighting societal benefits. We will have inspired speakers, interactive displays, artwork, and workshops. And if you're interested in showcasing your research, please get in touch. And also, it will be a great opportunity for networking. There are also sponsorship packages available with opportunities to share. So, stop sharing. And I just want to introduce our speaker today, Professor Dave Cleff. They joined the University of Bristol as Professor of Computer Science in 2007. Before that, he has held professional roles at the University of Southampton, at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, and has also worked for 7 years on commercial deployable AI and data analytics in industry in places such as Hewlett-Packard Labs and Deutsche Bank. He led the design and creation of the Jean Golding Institute, led the development of the university suite of engineering-based data science MSc degrees, and is the current director of the MSc Data Science program. He's also the director of the university's Intelligent Systems Lab, a group of over 130 researchers working in cutting-edge AI, machine learning, and data science. He's a fellow of the British Computer Society and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. In this presentation, Dave gives a whistle-stop tour through a reading list that guides the Technology, Innovation, Business and Society MSc module to show the range and breadth of issues that data science touches upon and its potential for good and bad. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks very much, Patty. I'm just going to have to share my screen and then I'm going to have to do the thing that we all do, which is say, can you see my screen? So, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Good. Okay. So thank you very much for that lovely intro. As Patty mentioned, I am the director of our MSc program in data science. We have 82 fantastic students on that degree. it's a pleasure to teach. We teach them coding in Python. We teach them GitHub for source code management. We teach them statistical computing. We teach them cloud computing. We teach them artificial intelligence, machine learning, visual analytics, data analytics. They do a group project with an external industry partner, where the industry partner specifies a problem and they work on it for 4 months. And then they do an individual project where they work on their own to create an MSc thesis, a big document about their own work. And today I'm here to tell you about none of that. Okay, one of my responsibilities on that MSc is I teach a unit called Technology, Innovation, Business and Society. And what that does is it provides the wider context for all the technical material that they get on the rest of their degree. And when Patty and Chiara were putting together this program for the JGI, they said, what could you talk about? And I said, well, I could show the reading list for that because it's 50 books long. And they said, that sounds a good idea. And then I realized that actually that's quite a big ask. So I have a water bottle here, but it's not full of water. It's full of Red Bull, because I decided that the only way I could get all the information that I want to impart to you was by being very highly caffeinated. So what I'm going to do, oops, now I can't advance my slides. Oh yeah, okay. So this is our internal webpage for Technology, Innovation, Business and Society. Really, that's what I'm going to be talking about. It's the technological context, the innovation context, the business context, the societal, the economic and the political contexts of being a data science practitioner in the current world. Now, what that does mean is I'm not really going to say anything about data science. If you'd like to a reading recommendation, here's a single book on data science. So this is from the MIT Press Essential Knowledge series. It was published about 3 years ago. Really lovely little book that gives you an overview of the whole field. But I'm not talking about that. Now the problem is, okay, this is a 50-minute slot, but Patty gave a very lovely introduction, which took 5 minutes, and there's 10 minutes at the end for the questions. So really, the title of this talk is somewhat misleading, because really this is 50 books in 35 minutes. That's going to be quite a rush. That's 42 seconds per book. And the issue then is that there's actually more than 50 books to talk about. So this is the full set of books that we cover in this unit. And if you do the maths, there's 11 books in a row and there's 5 rows, so there's 55 books. So I've actually got more than 50 books to talk about in much less than 50 minutes. Those 55 books cover 11 themes. 10 themes here are the kind of core themes of that we want our data science students to be familiar with and to have some exposure to, and fundamentally to have an opinion on, because this is almost like the kind of material that you would cover in an MBA, a Master of Business Administration, a business postgraduate degree, rather than a technical postgraduate degree. And indeed, very many of the books that I'm going to cover in this presentation, you would find in the business books section of a bookshop or a bookstore. So none of it is particularly technical. You don't need to be able to code. You don't need to be a statistician. You don't need to be versed in cloud computing to follow the arguments that I'm going to make here. But the other thing to recognize is that once you've read any of these books, really it's going to present you with things that you then need to form an opinion on. You need to either agree or disagree. So the themes that we cover are technology and innovation, because we want our data science students, when they graduate from here, not only to have a kind of an intellectual toolbox, a set of methods that they know how to apply, but we also want them to be the kind of individuals who can go out and create new tools. So it's not just about using other people's tools, it's about building your own. And fundamentally, in very many aspects of technology industry today, if you don't innovate, eventually someone else comes along and eats your lunch. So we teach them about technology and innovation. There's some core literature, you'll see it in a minute, on innovation. And then we talk about what happens after you've done the innovation step, how to commercialize, how to execute on innovation. We look at issues in how best to organize innovation in technology corporations, in commercially focused technology development companies. And in particular, the issue of whether to centralize your research into a core research lab or to have it in a more distributed or so-called open arrangement. Then we look at where the money comes from, then we look at some legal issues. And of course, we don't want anyone to break the law, but sometimes merely obeying the law is not sufficient. Sometimes you can do things which perhaps should be illegal but are not, and that for many people would be an unethical thing to do. So we spend one of the themes that we look at is responsibility and ethics. And then we look at what happens when your technology goes wrong, because risky technology, leading edge technology, often fails. And the nature of the failure is sometimes very specific to the risks that are embodied in leading edge technology. So we look at technology failures. And then following on from that, we look at situations where the technology is working fine, but somehow society deploys those technologies in ways which we find, depending on your opinion, to greater or lesser extents, unacceptable or unpalatable or indefensible. So we look at technology failures, then societal failures. Then we look at the fact that data analytics, gathering vast quantities of data and processing it appropriately, is something of interest to governments, to nation states, and that power can accrue to those who gather data at massive scale and act on it appropriately. So again, we'll cover that later. This is all the menu for what's coming today. And then finally, with the rise of AI, machine learning, and advanced automation, we look at the future of work. In fact, for long story, this year when we delivered the MSc, that last theme, the future of work, we just didn't have time to cover. There's a story to tell there, but I won't tell it here. And then the other thing to say is there's actually a zeroth theme, an introductory theme, which I'm going to cover right at the end of this talk because I can. So I'm going to drink some more Red Bull in just a moment. But so I'm having trouble advancing my slides here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover these 11 themes, and I'm going to give them 2 minutes 45 seconds each. And so I've programmed the timer on my phone to give me 2 minutes and 45 seconds. And when I start it, I will start talking about one of the themes, and I will talk for 2 minutes and 45 seconds, and then my phone will make the noise of a duck quacking. And when you hear the duck quacking, I'll just have to stop and move on to the next theme, because this is the only way that I can get through all 11 themes here, including the zeroth theme, in the time available and still leave 10 minutes for questions. And so what that means is that we're going to cover all these books really only very, very superficially. What I'm hoping is that somewhere along this list of 55 books, you'll see things where you think, hey, that sounds interesting, or I didn't know about that, I'd like to read that book. And if I've done my job, at the end of this talk, maybe you'll go to a bookstore, hopefully a bricks and mortar bookstore, an independent bookstore, rather than a certain famous mail order bookstore, and buy one of these books. That's my hope. And so all I'm hoping is that I provoke a bit of thought and a bit of consideration about some of these issues. So 10 themes, and I need to program I'm going to press start on my thing, and we go with theme 1. So we want our students to be technology innovators, and we want them to understand the nature of innovation. Now, the historian David Edgerton wrote this fantastic book called The Shock of the Old, where he argues that actually we as a society have this focus on innovation, and what we don't realize is that sometimes the most societally significant technologies are actually very old ones, and there's lots of heat and light, there's lots of heat and noise about leading edge technology, but sometimes very old technologies are still playing very, very significant roles. So we expose our students to the work of David Edgerton. He's still active as an academic, and he writes newspaper articles quite often. He's a very, very interesting person. And one of the things we do for all these books is we try and find video interviews on YouTube where the authors themselves speak about the work that they're presenting. So if you go and look for David Edgerton, very interesting on the very broad context of technology innovation. On an even broader context is the work of Carlota Perez. She's at the University of Cambridge, was at the University of Sussex, and she looks at technology revolutions since the Industrial Revolution, and she says there have been 5 major technology revolutions, and they each last for about 60 to 80 years. There was the initial Industrial Revolution, then there was the arrival of rail, and steam engines on rails so that you could move things from A to B faster than a running horse. Then there was the arrival of the internal combustion engine, steel, electricity, and petrochemicals. Then there was the telecoms revolution, and then there was the IT revolution. And one of the interesting things is that she says that actually the IT revolution is coming close to playing out. It's almost had its 60 years or its 80 years, depending on where you say it started. And so for that reason, there's going to be, if if her theory is correct, there will be another new technology which plays the role that we have become very familiar with IT playing as the thing that is a hotbed of innovation and is changing patterns of work and is making founders of companies immensely wealthy. So just as that used to happen in railways 100, 150 years ago, and now it doesn't because railways have become an established technology, she argues exactly that process will happen to IT, to computing, and some other technology revolution will come along. So taking a kind of 250-year perspective on where we are in the current technology revolution is very illuminating. And then no one could talk about technology innovation without mentioning the work of Clayton Christensen. Oh no, but the duck is quacking. So all I can say is I have to stop on this. I'm sorry that I didn't have time to talk too much. I actually didn't say anything about Clay Christensen's work. The key thing about Clay Christensen is that he came up with this notion of disruptive technology, which means something very particular. It has a particular technical definition, which is to do with technology that when it first occurs, looks like it's not very good, and eventually comes and disrupts an entire industry. And an awful lot of, so think about what Netflix is doing to the movie industry or the TV industry. Think about what solid state drives are doing to how stuff is stored on a computer. However, I can't talk any more about that because I've got to move on to the next one, and I've just restarted another 2 minutes and 45 seconds. So let's say you've come up with an innovation, you've come up with an invention, a new way of doing data science or data analytics or AI or machine learning. Well, what next? And there's this really great book by Govindarajan and Trimble called The Other Side of Innovation, which talks about everything you need to do in order to get your innovation out into the world, changing the world, maybe making money if you're engaged in profit-directed innovation, or maybe making the world a better place if you're engaged in innovation for the wider social good, for the commonwealth rather than for individual wealth. And in order to understand that, there's a classic book which was written initially in the late 50s, early 60s, and has gone through multiple editions. So this is the cover of the 5th edition, and that's Everett Rogers on the diffusion of innovations, where he looks at how a new innovation, a new idea, spreads through some population, some community of potential customers or users of that innovation. Fascinating book, full of examples. It's about this thick. It's an awful lot of reading. And this character, Gordon Moore, in the IT industry, basically took Everett Rogers' key ideas, which was this notion of a kind of bell curve of the number of people that are newly adopting a particular technology, and he simplified the language and kind of ran it into marketing speak and came up with this very famous notion of crossing the chasm. Now, I probably, almost definitely, as soon as I start to explain that, the duck is going to quack. So I realise that I'm on thin ice here with hot slippers. But in a nutshell, what he says is that on that bell curve, very often there's a gap, he calls it the chasm, where early adopters have all started to use the innovation, but the majority of users have yet to do it. And he observes that very many innovations fail to cross that gap. And that if you really want your innovation to spread and to become a mass market product, you need to understand the nature of failing to cross the gap in order to understand how best to cross that gap, the chasm. So that's Everett Rogers. Now, I was trying to catch up with my time. Let me see how much time we've got left. I've got 20 seconds left. I'm going to try and get ahead of myself so that I can say a bit more about some of the other things. So here we come on. Oh, wait, I've got to reprogram my phone. What I should have really here, next time I do this, I'll have an assistant with a clock, because doing two things at once is not my strength. Okay, the clock's running again. Now we're talking about centralized versus open innovation. Now, as Patty mentioned in the introduction, one of the things that I've done in the course of my career is I spent 6.5 years working for Hewlett-Packard Research Labs, and it was fantastic. It was instituted by Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard. It started in Palo Alto. In fact, it's Hewlett-Packard's first garage that they rented to get their work done in is seen as the official US landmark of the birthplace of Silicon Valley. These were Silicon Valley giants, and they really understood how to organize innovation. And they did that by building centralized laboratories where loads of researchers just did research, just had wild ideas. Many of those ideas would not execute, they would not make money, but the small number that did bankrolled all the failures. So that's why one of the books here is Bill and Dave, the story of how Bill and Dave built Hewlett-Packard. But of course, HP Labs was not the only big research lab. Xerox PARC was very, very famous in the IT industry, the birthplace of the Windows icon, mouse, pointer interface that we all now use. Very famously, a young computer entrepreneur by the name of Steve Jobs saw that Windows icon, mouse, pointer, or WIMP display, and he said, I want that on the next computer that my company builds. His company, of course, was Apple. And if we're looking at big research labs, the big daddy of them all was Bell Labs. Multiple Nobel Prizes, huge amounts of money, funded essentially by a monopoly organization, which was AT&T Bell, the American telephone system, which before it was broken up under US antitrust, was just one very big company that ran all of America's telephone systems. So it had lots of money and it could fund blue sky research, leading edge research, Nobel Prize winning research. Why is this of interest? Because I don't work at HP Labs anymore, and HP Labs is a lot smaller than it ever was. Xerox PARC is a lot smaller than it ever was. Bell Labs is a shadow of its former self. This isn't a criticism of the managers involved. It's more a consequence of that book you can see on the upper part of the slide, Open Innovation, written by Henry Chesbrough. It totally changed the way people thought about how best to organize research and innovation in a corporate context. He argued that instead of spending money for centralized research labs that are internal to the organization, you should instead take that money and spend it on acquiring startups who are engaged in innovative research, who have been funded by venture capital, because that way you can basically pick and choose the successes. The duck is quacking. So unfortunately I have to stop and move on to the next one. Okay, so really that story of centralized versus open innovation and the closure of centralized research labs is a conversation about how best do we finance or structure the flow of funding into innovative processes. And if you want to be a data scientist, if you want to be an innovator, if you don't know an answer to that question, you're not going to get very far. So we look at the work of Mariana Mazzucato, who wrote this highly influential, extremely readable book on the entrepreneurial state, where essentially, I mean, I've never met her, I've read her books, I would characterize them as being centrist, but to the left of center on the political spectrum. Okay, so what she argues is that it's a statement of fact that very many what appear to be independent entrepreneurial activities, like, for instance, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak starting the Apple Computer Company, or the birth of mobile telephony in the private sector, very often that was enabled, facilitated, and in fact made possible, in the sense that it would have been impossible without huge amounts of state funding, taxpayer money, going into universities to fund research, and that innovation then transferred out into technology companies. And very often what happens is entrepreneurs combine existing research, or existing technology developments, which have arisen through state-funded research programs. So that's Mazzucato's view. There are other people that say the way forward is to do startups. So Eric Ries wrote this book, The Lean Startup, came up with this notion of minimum viable products. He said, just start a company, get the product out there, get it in front of the customers, see what the customers like. I think, yes, I've just realized I forgot to restart the duck, so I'm going to have to ad-lib this one. So yeah, Rees's book is about 20 years old now, but it's become something of a Bible for people who are interested in founding their own companies. And then Reid Hoffman, who created LinkedIn, working with Chris Ye, wrote this book on blitz scaling, where he argues, okay, if you're going to start a company, the thing to do is start a company, and whatever you do, don't start small. Get as much funding as you can into the company and get as big as possible in order to essentially swamp and control the market, push out your competitors, and then you have that competitive advantage that you can then use as a kind of cushion as you develop your product and make it better. So different views on different ways of financing and organizing the flow of funds into research. And now what I'm really going to do is I really am going to press start. Okay, so once again, it's counting down. I'm going to go on to the next one. By the way, if you find that I'm talking too quickly, just listen faster. That's what I tell all my students. They never laugh. And the great thing about online presentations is I can't hear whether you're laughing or not. So I'm now assuming that you're all splitting your sides. Okay. Anyhow, if you want to be an innovator, if you want to work in innovative technology, data analytics, AI, machine learning, you have to understand the legal framework that you're operating within. So in a commercially oriented context, you need to understand intellectual property law. And David Bainbridge's book on intellectual property is just a magnum opus of UK IP law with lots of case examples. Of course, intellectual property law is similar but not identical in different countries. So, as soon as you go as far as Scotland, or definitely if you go to the US, there are some differences. But also, when we're talking about data science, data scientists, if you don't understand GDPR, you're going to be in terrible trouble. And fantastic. I've taught myself various musical instruments by buying the For Dummies guide to those musical instruments, and I do genuinely recommend GDPR for Dummies because, can I say this? It's not the most exciting thing to read, GDPR. I mean, it's basically a set of regulations, but you do have to know about those regulations, and so you might as well learn about them in a way that's relatively light-hearted and yet still gets all the facts to you. So my professional recommendation, if you want to teach yourself about GDPR, is that that's a good place to start. The other book that you can see here, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, is a classic, and it's a study of the origins and the kind of the founding principles of the open source movement. Because intellectual property law is really about, I've invented something and I need to kind of protect it for myself. Maybe I'll patent it, or maybe I'll establish it as a copyright or trademark, or maybe I'll treat it as a trade secret. However, there are other ways of spreading innovations. So another way of spreading innovations, which actually has worked in my career quite nicely, is you write some software, you release it as open source, you explain to people how it works. They will then see it for free and they copy it. And of course, I've allowed them to copy it because I made it open source. And so the fact that I work in that area becomes spread through a community of users. And then when I next release some work, there's a bigger audience for my innovation. The duck is quacking once again, so I'm going to stop, and then we're going to move on, and then we're going to restart the timer. So start again. Yeah, it really is running. So now in the first 5 themes, what we've done then is we've covered the nature of technology innovation and what to do to get beyond innovation, and then how best to organize innovation, how to get money for it, and what the legal frameworks are for it. But as I said in the introduction, merely obeying the law, merely keeping within the letter of the law, sometimes enables, especially if the laws cover technologies which are newly developed, or cover application areas which are relatively unexplored, relatively unthought through, it can become very possible to work in such a way that you're not breaking any laws, but you're doing things which are perhaps irresponsible, or perhaps morally questionable, maybe even morally offensive, depending, of course, on an individual person or group or society's view of what is morally correct. And I'm extremely, there are many good reasons for working at University of Bristol, but one great reason is that my colleague Richard Owen in the School of Management is a world leader on this notion of responsible innovation. There's now a kind of whole research community that are trying to work out methodologies and practices for ensuring that innovation is responsible as opposed to purely legal. Furthermore, we're seeing this in our students, that many of our students are saying, I don't just want to work for a company that makes a lot of money for a shareholder. I want to make the world a better place. And sometimes that notion of kind of shareholder value versus societal value, sometimes they're not perfectly aligned. Sometimes you have to make a choice. There's a conflict, a decision to be made between, do I do the socially responsible thing, which may not make my shareholders quite as much money, or do I just maximize shareholder value? And I think we can fairly characterize the latter half of the 20th century and the first decade or so of the 21st century as a period in which shareholder value was viewed as paramount above all things. But I think it's now becoming increasingly clear that there are major societal concerns like climate change, which are going to require us to scale back on the pursuit of profit in order to do the societally correct thing. But responsible innovation isn't the only game in town. Okay, there are established teachings on ethics in engineering and ethics in computing, which we also want to expose our students to. And in particular, a great book is Kearns and Zoth on the ethical algorithm. So what is it if you're a computer scientist? There's the duck, so I'm going to have to move on. What is it if you're a computer scientist that's writing algorithms that are changing people's lives or affecting people's lives? How can you do that ethically? Great book, really recommend it. Next one, let's program the duck. Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm just going to need a small dose of caffeine. 1 second. Oh, thank you. Okay, so even if you're acting responsibly, even if you're acting ethically, sometimes you will build technology where you think, you've done your best. The team who have constructed it have done their best. They think they've thought through all the possibilities, and no one likes to consider that maybe things will go very badly wrong. But every now and again that does happen. And it turns out there are thinkers, writers, who've been considering this for a very long time. So in particular, Charles Perrow wrote this famous book called Normal Accidents, where he argued that some engineered systems are so complicated that you can look at them and you can know that an accident is likely to occur because of the nature of the complexity internal to that system. So he said accidents become normal in that sense. Henry Petrovsky talks about the human factors in, and James Reason also. They're two authors who talk about the fact that we humans are not perfect. So even if we engineer a system, if that system is interacted with by humans, or if humans operate it, you may have operator error or interactions where humans act in unpredictable or even irrational ways, but your system needs to be engineered to cope with that. Possibly the hardest read, but the most important book in this collection of 5 is The Challenger Launch Decision, which was written by the sociologist Diane Vaughan in the late 90s. So this was a good best part of a decade after the Challenger disaster, in which the space shuttle blew up 72 seconds after launch with loss of vehicle and loss of all the crew. She analysed all the records that had come up in the Presidential Accident Inquiry to try to understand how could an organisation like NASA launch a spaceship in conditions where, after the fact, it became clear it should never have been launched because it was way too cold and important rubber seals would fail and the rockets could very likely explode. Engineers at NASA and at Morton Thiokol, the company that made the rockets, had known about this problem for ages, and basically they kept on assuming that because there hadn't been a disaster yet, that was further evidence that there would not be a disaster in future. Diane Vaughan gave a name to that process. She called it normalization of deviance. The deviant event is the failure of the rubber seal, and the normalization is people kind of get used to it. People think, well, we haven't lost a space shuttle yet, so maybe we're okay. Of course, eventually Mother Nature catches up with you, and then it's really horrible. I'm going to have to stop. Organisation at the Limit was a book about the Columbia disaster, which Diane Vaughan also contributed to. Because of her work on the Challenger launch decision, she was invited to be a member of the accident investigation on the Columbia one too. You may think teaching data scientists about exploding spaceships is a strange thing to do, but the lessons in there are fundamental and they're deep. And in fact, all technologists, all engineers should know about normalization of deviance and how organizational culture can affect the safety of well-engineered systems. And then, let me just start my duck again. And then, every now and again, the technology doesn't fail. Things have been done reasonably responsibly, so people certainly haven't broken the law, but the deployment of the technology can be a failing, a societal failing. Democracies, free and fair elections can be interfered with. It is argued that the organisation Cambridge Analytica was promoting itself as an organisation that used advanced data analytics techniques in order to help sway elections in ways that were unprecedented. They have lawyers. I have to be careful exactly what words I say here. But books like Targeted by Brittany Kaiser, The People versus Tech by James Bartlett, Democracy Hacked, they all cover essentially the same story, which is the rise of data analytics, which allows entire populations to be monitored, and then the rise of social media and machine-generated content, which allows very specific messages to be targeted at very specific, tiny subsets of that population, can change the electoral landscape. Elections that used to be free and fair might cease to be so. If not already, then at some point in the future, unless we take appropriate action. So there are books on how this affects politics. But then there are other societal failures. So Caroline Criado Perez wrote this fantastic book, Invisible Women. In the year it was published, I think it was 2 years ago, maybe 3, it won pretty much every major science book prize, and deservedly so, because she documents this litany, a shameful, embarrassing litany, speaking as a guy, of the extent to which male-dominated engineering tends to think that basically the only things that matter in doing evaluations are male-sized objects. So crash test dummies tend to be all male-sized. Most drug trials tend to take place on bodies of students who are young men. And so lethal doses or recommended doses or minimum doses for drugs tend to be skewed by this gender bias in the selection of the people who are doing, the people who are the subjects of the experiments. This applies not only in crash test dummies and in pharmaceutical trials, but also in an awful lot of issues of concern to data scientists, to data ethicists, to computer scientists, software engineers, software developers, and so on. I'm going to have to stop because of the duck, but also Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Mass Destruction and Schneps and Colmes' Math on Trial. Math on Trial talks about the misuse of statistics in the judicial system. Cathy O'Neill talks about, again, societal inequalities. Often underprivileged groups their underprivilege is extended or amplified because of misapplied data analytics, misapplied mathematics, misapplied software systems. So I'm going to advance it and put my duck on again. Oh man, don't worry. There's 3 more themes to go, and then we can do questions. Okay, it's running again. So the societal failures theme kind of looks at where things are obviously going wrong, but then there's another side to that story where things are kind of going wrong, but deliberately, really, because either particular corporations or particular governments have decided that the most appropriate thing is to use technology in unprecedented ways that, it's fair to argue, changes the nature of the relationship between the user of the technology and that institution, whether it's the government or a corporation. So in this theme, we look at state-sponsored or state-enacted surveillance of entire nations. So Glenn Greenwald's book, No Place to Hide, talks about the Snowden revelations and the extent to which the US state agencies were engaged in wholesale, largely, well, it would perhaps be too strong to describe it as unauthorized surveillance, but the people being surveilled definitely didn't know the extent to which they were being surveilled. James Griffith's book, The Great Firewall of China, looks at the way in which the Chinese government have enacted controls on the internet, the Great Firewall of China, which mean that a very large number of people, the entire population of China, have their access to information significantly restricted. And there was, recently, last week, the week before, it was the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And if you go and search for that, you'll see news coverage of the extent to which it's almost impossible to find out internet sources from within China that talk about the Tiananmen Square massacre. That's essentially closed down by the Chinese state. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing will depend to some extent on your political views, to some extent on whether you grew up in China or not, I imagine. The books on the lower level here, so Rana Foroohar, she's a journalist for the Financial Times. She writes this brilliant book called Don't Be Evil. That was the founding motto, the strapline of Google. And she argues, well, you know what? They're not that good at not being evil anymore. She looks at the extent to which transnational companies have amassed immense wealth. And so here, the culprits are few and well known. Companies like Google, Facebook, maybe Apple, but less so, maybe Amazon, maybe Microsoft. Sorry, the duck is quacking. She argues that they spend an awful lot of money on political lobbying in order to make lawmakers change laws to make their businesses more profitable and to make sure that there are no legal impediments to them doing business the way they want to do it. And in fact, her book came after Shoshana Zuboff had written this book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which is a very thick book, and it's pretty heavy going in places, but it's a really important book. I think it's a book that everyone should read if you want to be a citizen in the 21st century, because what she says is that capitalism has shifted. We are now the product. If you use a free service like Facebook or Google, then data is being gathered on you and commercialized in a way that is without precedent. But because the duck has quacked, I cannot say much more. Remember, all of this, the duck, the quacking and everything, is to save time at the end for some questions. So I'm happy to take questions on any of the things that we've covered here. Okay, and the last thing, which this year we didn't have time to include in the course because we had one fewer week than originally envisaged, is the future of work. So right now, around the world, there are, I don't know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who proudly earn their living driving vehicles. Bus drivers, lorry drivers, train drivers, taxi drivers, and there are multiple voices arguing that probably within the next decade, maybe 15 years, an awful lot of those people are just not going to have a job anymore because autonomous vehicles, self-driving vehicles, are tantalizingly within reach. Now, some people I know who are world experts in AI say that actually the excitement about self-driving vehicles is somewhat overblown, but there are definitely professions which are as threatened by the rise of data-intensive AI and machine learning as, say, being a blacksmith, a farrier, the person that puts shoes on horses. You know, before the arrival of the motor car, a disruptive technology, pretty much every village had a farrier because everyone was getting around on horses and those horses needed shoeing every now and again. Now, there are still farriers, but there are many, many fewer of them because technology changed the demand pattern. And it could be that the technologies that we've been looking at, that using vast data analytics, AI and machine learning, could change the demand pattern for human labour. It could be argued that pretty much any job that is currently done at a computer could be automated. Now, there's an awful lot of needles in that haystack that we'd need to. Bad metaphor. There's a lot of detail to that argument that we could tease out. But there are people like Brynjolfsson and McAfee, Martin Ford, and the Suskins who write extremely well thought out articles and books on the future of work and the way in which, quite possibly, we're about to see seismic changes in patterns of distribution of work that are almost without precedent. Maybe the only precedent is the first industrial revolution, when a largely agrarian, agricultural economy totally shifted to become an industrial economy. And what that might mean is very large numbers of people are working much, much less. Now, plausibly, you could organise society in such a way that those people are paid some amount of money, a minimum wage. I've just realised I forgot the duck again. Sorry, I'm going to do it again. Or maybe not. So there are utopian visions and there are dystopian visions for the future effect on work of AI, machine learning and data-intensive methods. Okay, so that was our 10 themes, and I did say that there's a theme 0, and that's the last theme, and the clock is now running, the duck is doing its thing, and that's don't believe the hype. So right at the start of our course, we get our students to look at these 4 books. The first one, Mastering the Hype Cycle, is written by a couple of consultants for the management consultancy company Gartner. It's a really great idea, it's kind of funny, and then they turned it into a really long book, and I don't recommend that book. The hype cycle is one of those things that everyone should know about, but if you do a little bit of Googling, you'll see the graph, you'll know the names of the points on the graph, things like the pit of uncertainty and I've forgotten them now, the peak of inflated expectations, things like that. But definitely, I don't recommend reading the whole book. However, the other 3 books, Rosenzweig's The Halo Effect, Stuart Ritchie's Science Fictions, and Bergstrom and West on Calling Bullshit, are fantastic books. The Halo Effect is very old. It's a good 20 years old. But basically what he says is an awful lot of business literature is just wrong. It's just hot air. And many of the 55 books that we've covered in this slot today are business books. Now, I like to think that they're not wrong. I like to think that I've picked good books and that I've rejected bad books. But Rosenzweig's book is a book for people that read business books about how to tell whether a business book is good or bad. However, our data science students, they're scientists, they're engineers. So we also get them to read Ritchie's Science Fictions, which just talks about shocking, recent, current cases of fraud, bias, negligence and hype in science. Because if you think that all science is pure and perfect, you're in for some really nasty surprises. And we cannot afford to think that all science, all engineering is pure and perfect, because there are bad actors out there. And if you're not looking for them, you might not find them. And then Bergstrom and West, just a brilliant book, made better by the fact that each chapter has its own supporting lecture, which is freely available on YouTube. They put me to shame. I should write a book and I should make a whole set of lectures, but I've been a bit busy doing other things. But I would say if you only want to read 3 books as a consequence of all the books that I've shown here, these 3, The Halo Effect, Science Fictions and Calling Bullshit, are the best ones. There we go. That's the last time the duck will quack, and I think that's my last slide. Oh yeah, the only other thing I wanted to say is these are the locations of real physical bookshops in central Bristol, many of which are independent. I think independent bookshops do a great service to our society, and it would be a great shame if people lived in towns where there are no bookshops. So of course there is a large mail order company that will sell you books cheaper than these, but my recommendation would be, if you've liked any of the books in today's that I've covered in today's session, maybe contact one of these outlets and see if they can get it for you. Thank you very much. And now,
thank you so much, Dave. That's amazing how much you managed to share with us in a very short space of time. So
just a little bit more Red Bull.
We have a few questions about. We'll have the reading list available. So we will share the recording of the session and the reading list, and I'm sure they will answer. Well, we'll have some questions now, but I'm sure they will be very keen to hear from all of you. But yeah, we have some questions now. So one question from Ola Mekalek. I hope it's the right pronunciation. We'd love to hear further thoughts on the concept of disruption. What and who is getting disrupted? Who wins? Is disruption a normative concept?
Great question. How long have I got to answer? Should I set the duck running again? I mean, really, we could talk about that for a whole session. So Christensen's writing on disruption, he has this very specific definition. It's where you have an incumbent, an established technology. So he talks quite a lot about mini mills in the steel industry, but the example that he gives that's closer to my home is storage devices on computers. So he talks about floppy disks. I'm old, I remember I actually touched a floppy disk, and they used to be 8 inches, and then they got smaller but higher capacity at 5 inches, and then they got smaller again, and they were encased in plastic at 3 inches. And people were making these spinning disks, and of course, probably many of the people here on this call can remember hard disks being inside laptops and PCs. But really, in the last 5, maybe 10 years, there's been this wholesale abandonment of that technology in favor of silicon chips, solid state drives. And so what he has this kind of famous graph, which I can't really do with my hands, where he says the new technology comes along and initially it looks too expensive or too slow. It serves some different market. And so the people who are in the incumbent industry, they think, well, that's never going to worry us because we're really good at doing what we do. And our customers, that we know their needs are increasing and we know we can always meet their needs, and that's fantastic. And that what the mistake is, the innovator's dilemma is, the mistake is to think that because the technology when it first appears is not good, the mistake is if you don't work out that eventually it will get not better than your technology, but sufficiently good to meet your customers' needs. And when that happens, your customers stop buying your technology and they buy the new technology. So then if you are running a hard disk company, a floppy disk company, you're facing a dilemma, because really what you're told in business is play to your core strengths, keep on investing in the technology you know well, but actually you should invest in disruptive or potentially disruptive technologies, because otherwise you will eventually go out of business. I think that answers the question.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dave. A question that is kind of these times is sharing medical data. So with the upcoming NHS digital data grab in terms of ethics and responsibility and privacy, what are your thoughts on sharing your own data?
I'm glad someone asked that question. I am planning on writing to my GP and asking that my data isn't shared. Here we get into personal beliefs and personal politics, but I'm not sure that I trust the individuals that are giving assurances. I think it's being done in a way that lacks transparency. And so my personal view is that I will be requesting that my data and the data of my wife and kids, well, my wife will be making her request, and we'll ask that our kids' data isn't shared either. I'm happy for the NHS to have my data. I'm not happy for an American corporation to be commercialising it.
Thank you for that. What do you think of the EU Data Spaces project?
It's a very good thing. Once again, because we're talking personal opinions, I wish we were still in the EU, and then we could play a bigger part in it.
Great, thank you. And how do you engage with the students in thinking ethically or socially about technology? How about the curriculum? Is it apolitical? Is it positive, quantitative? How the skills engage the students into this thinking?
Well, I think this year, I forgot to say, this year was the first year that this MSc has run, and so it's the first year that this unit has run. And I think it was made more difficult by the fact that all the teaching was online. So this year, I think, and this is kind of me being self-critical, is really what we did is we exposed people to this literature, but we didn't necessarily force them to engage in it. We didn't force them to to consider ethically difficult situations and come down on one side or the other of from some potential set of possible actions. However, all of our teaching is constantly reviewed, and we always try to make next year better than the current year. So I think in future, especially once we can go back to small group teaching in the same room, it becomes possible to then better enables kind of problem-based learning, where we say, okay, here's the situation. What would you do in this situation? People can go off into small groups, discuss it, then feedback, and then we can have some sort of wider group discussion about what is the best way to do things. However, one of the things that and this is no criticism of our students, is I think the current secondary school education system and undergraduate education system increasingly delivers people who just want to know how to get the correct marks. And so when you give people a situation where you say there is no right answer, and you need to come up with your own considered view of this situation, because that is what it will be like in the real world, there's a disappointing tendency for people to say, well, show me the marking scheme. And trying to come up with constructive ways to deal with that when you're teaching ethics is an interesting challenge. I mean, I don't think it's impossible, but it gives us some challenges as teachers. But that's why I like doing my job. It's challenging.
There was an associate question about, do you think or are students taught innovation and social science methods alongside the data science methods? So if they want to do their own thinking and analyzing data using social science methods, could they do that? Well, again, this year, this year it's been more about exposing them to the existence of those things than actually engaging in practice of them. Bear in mind that this is one unit on what's a largely technical degree in engineering. And I have a real passion for the material that I teach here, but I have to fit it in a certain number of hours, and there are lots of things that I have to leave out, which I would like to include more. However, I see this as preparation for what the students are doing right now, and right now they're just engaging in their individual project where they're working, on nothing but that project for the next 4 months, and some of those projects have been influenced by conversations with our industry partners. And so in some sense, that's their first step at engaging in individual innovation. When they do the group project, there's also opportunities for innovation there. But again, I think the most productive way of teaching these things is by repeatedly kind of setting people challenges and then constructively, critically evaluating their responses to those challenges, and then introspecting about what the process was like. So I think trying to teach innovation by saying read lots of books on innovation is nowhere near as productive as saying, okay, let's go through that innovation process. But on this particular unit, it's very difficult to find the time to do that. However, we have the fantastic Bristol Innovation Programme, a whole set of degrees with titles like computer science with innovation or physics with innovation. And I think if someone was really focused on becoming an innovator, then one of those programs would perhaps be better than this data science program. But what we wanted to do was create
fully qualified, first-class data scientists and data engineers who are familiar with the notion of innovation and are familiar with the ideas and the concepts and the language of innovation, and who've done a bit of innovation as part of the education.
Thank you, Dave. How does remote working play into the future of work? The technologies have been around for ages, but it just took a pandemic for companies to take it seriously.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, all the books that I showed you were written before the pandemic. I think there are some really interesting books that will come out in about 7 years' time, once people have seen what happens when the pandemic ends. I mean, I think for very many people, they've realised that remote working has a set of advantages. I don't think it's always the ideal option. Some people desperately want to get back into an office, interacting with people. The extent to which it affects patterns of work is as yet unseen. But I'm a citizen. I read the newspapers, and some big companies, I forget the exact names, but some big insurers or legal companies or investment banks are starting to say, well, you know what? Actually, we'll allow people to work at home maybe 3 days a week, maybe 4 days a week, maybe entirely, if that suits them. And having spent some time in industry, it strikes me as obvious that someone in estates management is looking at their spreadsheet and thinking, wow, we've got 5 buildings and maybe we only need 3. So there's actually going to be an economic driver, because you can cut costs by not requiring everyone to be at work. I think the great thing about the pandemic is it's shown that we can, very many people can work productively remotely at home. I've found it a very productive period. However, I'm acutely aware that it has stored up a whole bunch of mental health issues for a wide range of people, but especially for younger people. So I can't wait for our students. If any of our students want to study remotely, then I will be there to support them. But I think we are social apes, we are social animals, and there's something about not having social contact. I'm lucky, I live in a house that I like with a family that I love. But it's a very different deal if you've just moved flown halfway around the world and you're in a rented room in some suburb of Bristol and you don't know anyone and you're just working remotely. It's no surprise to me that people do not want that to happen or do not want that to continue. So I think yeah, it will have a big impact on patterns of work, but we need to remember that we're human beings, we're not just workers, and we have human needs that are met by socializing with people across the day. Excuse me, across the day or across the week.
Thank you. One question: what are your thoughts on effective ways of harnessing data science tools for social activism, social justice?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, so I would like to say, it's easy, just do this and this and this. But of course, most data is owned. So the problem is perhaps getting access to data. I mean, Facebook have lots of data, but they're not going to give it to you necessarily. Google have lots of data, they're not going to give it to you. So using data science tools to enable social activism, I think many of the tools, certainly many of the tools we teach on the MSc are open source. They're freely available. So it's now possible to do things that used to require, you would need an army of programmers, but now you can just assemble these tools, think of them as like Lego bricks, and you can start to make your own system out of these pre-existing bricks, which are freely available. It used to be that you needed a supercomputer to crunch through loads of data, but now you can, if you've got a credit card, you can use a cloud service like Amazon AWS, Amazon Web Services, which is the big one, or Google Cloud Platform or Microsoft Azure. So you don't need a supercomputer. Basically, if you've got a laptop, you can assemble the software, you can upload it to the cloud, it can do supercomputing jobs, and it can give you the answer back, and it might cost you, £3 a week. So that changes the world dramatically. That it lowers the barrier to entry for these tools to be used in socially productive ways. But the big question always is, where does the data come from? And if the data is public domain, then that's great. But if the data is non-public domain, then it becomes problematic. And that, this brings us back to Shoshana Zuboff and her notion of surveillance capitalism. Is data is the new oil, and people fight wars over oil. People don't give oil away. And I think, unfortunately, that's going to be a limiting factor for a lot
for
of
that. Another question is, what is one thing that has kept you interested in technology?
There isn't one factor. I think I'm just a bit of a geek, really. So you know, I've been teaching computer science in universities for 30 years or so, and what I like about it is that most years I'm teaching stuff that 5 years previously I couldn't have taught, because not me necessarily, you know, but people around the world just keep on coming up with new technologies or new tools or new ideas. And so what has kept me in love with this job is the fact that the world keeps changing. I think it would be different if I was teaching something that never changes. But what I teach changes all the time.
Thank you so much. I think, yeah, we learn a lot. Sorry, there's a couple of questions that we didn't manage to answer. Yeah, there was a shout out for a book, Good Data by Sam Gilbert.
Okay.
Read that as well. But yeah, thank you so much, Dave. And it's been fascinating. And thank you everybody for joining us. And I hope to see you again. And don't forget, we had 2 networking sessions tomorrow and on Friday at 1 p.m. It would be lovely to meet you and say hello. So bye for now, and thanks again.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.